ladies.
Hey ladies, we're back.
We are back, and today we got another good topic for you.
Oh yes.
We're going to be talking about comparing your marriage to others and the dangers in doing that.
So dangerous, right?
Girl.
So, and Tina, let's be real. I mean, if you've got a really good core group of friends, a good group of friends that are always around each other, it is so easy to do it.
I think so.
That's easy.
Especially when maybe you and your spouse aren't on the best of terms, and you be looking like, well, they do all this stuff over here, and they do all this stuff over here. With John sure does, pick up his socks.
Yeah, he does a good job, and that's a good point. So sometimes it's when you and your spouse have a little tiff going on, and you're trying to. Because a lot of times with our spouse, we're trying to help them understand why something is important to us.
Right.
And maybe our spouses are like, well, that just doesn't make sense. Because a lot of times we speak different languages, right?
We do.
And so I think what happens is, well, you see how such and such does X, Y, and Z. That's what I'm saying that I like. Or, well, what about when she does this or he does that? And so I do think it comes a lot of the times when we've got a little something in between us that we're trying to communicate. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the worst things to do is compare your spouse to another person of the same sex, or another man, or another blah blah blah. For one, I think I think no marriage is the same, and I think marriages function differently depending on who's in it.
Absolutely.
So what works for one certainly may not work for the other. What so and so looks and does in public may not be what so and so does in private. So I just certainly want to caution you to be thinking about what works for you in your marriage, and what's the agreement that you and your spouse have worked out, versus looking at how somebody else does something, or how somebody is treating their significant other.
And Tara made a good point about what agreement you guys have. So you've always got to stick to what are your foundational things that you say in your marriage that you're always going to do, and that you're always going to abide by. And so what I would say is, no matter what happens, it's easy to want to kind of change those rules in your marriage, but you got to stick firm to those, because things will come along that look really good, right? So, there's a spouse that buys their spouse flowers every Monday, or that runs a bath for them every Friday, and those things sound really good. But what we also are not often privy to is what got them to do those things. So, like, why is he now buying flowers every Monday, or why is he now
is he making up for something?
Right. So a lot of times we're comparing. And I read it somewhere one time. It says, don't compare your chapter 1 to someone's chapter 20.
Come on now.
So you don't know what those couples have been through. And we're over here in our stage 1, married only, 1 year. And then you're looking at somebody who's been married 10 years, and you're saying, well, why can't we do that? But you don't know what they've been through from that year 1 to 10, and you're comparing it, which could be very dangerous, as you said.
I think it's such a great point. I think it's so easy to evaluate somebody based on what you see, right? You see the good, shiny, and clean, but you don't know the effort and the work that they put into their marriage to get to those points.
Oh my God.
And secondly, the other thing I would say is, everything that looks shiny isn't always like gold, Even though it may look like in a public setting that this person is super happy with their husbands, and they just look so happy, you don't know what it's like at home with them either. So the old adage is, grass isn't always greener. You really need to be able to be content with what you have, and really figure out what is going to work for you and your spouse.
Yeah, and Tamara, so be content with what you have. Figure out what works for you and your spouse. All I hear in what she just said is communication.
Girl,
so the big piece about it is we have to communicate. And we're not sitting before you guys because we've got it figured out. We're 100% great at it. We just have learned some things along the way. And we have good exposure to some really healthy marriages. And also, we are feeding our marriages with healthy things. So I think the important part about it, I go to a marriage Bible study every Wednesday, and that is uber important for me, because it makes us talk about things that may be uncomfortable for us to talk about any other time. But just think about it that way. Proper communication really solves a lot of the issues in marriage. And like we said, the comparing things, I think another thing is when we start thinking about how we really emasculate our husbands, or when we're starting to compare them to other men. So think about, that's opening up a whole nother door, thinking about, okay, well, my husband doesn't do this. I'll give you an example. My husband doesn't like to cut the grass, and that's okay with me. Year 1, I was livid because I saw my father cutting the grass all the time. So I thought that my husband was supposed to cut the grass too, but the way we were raised, doesn't mean that that's how our marriage is going to be and what it'll look like. So we've got to be careful not to
That is such a great point.
compare our marriage to our parents' marriage, because a lot of
That
times
is
we're looking
true.
at what we saw growing up. So
No, I love that point that you just made about what you've been what has been modeled for you may not necessarily be what's been modeled for your spouse. And I think to your point about communication, it's really sitting down and coming up with an agreement about what's going to work for y'all. That, like you mentioned, Derek don't like to cut grass.
if he doesn't like to cut grass, that's fine.
But you know what? Derek is a fantastic father.
Oh my God, he cooks.
Derek
he cleans.
cooks.
He is the best husband in the world, but we get caught up in the spirit of comparison.
Girl.
That is one thing that can damage any relationship.
100%.
Tamara and I's relationship, it can damage, your marriage, it can damage work relationships. So, I mean, we're talking specifically about marriage, but to Tamara's point, I mean, God, it could be any relationship damaged by that.
And I think it took, Steve and I learned that a little bit early on in our marriage, but I mean, it still takes time to really kind of perfect what works for you and what doesn't work for, what doesn't work for you. So I would just encourage, to your point, communication. Be wary of comparing yourself. Everything that shines ain't gold.
Woo! Come on now. Reality shows get us every time. Okay?
Isn't that the truth?
Yes.
And even though you see great marriages, just know that there is a lot of work that went into that. You don't know what's been put in in private to get to that point. So
yeah, and Tamara, the last thing I'd say too, when I think about reality shows, I think about even when we were single. I mean, think about looking at married couples thinking like, oh, I want that. I want to be married. I want to be married. Well, and sometimes, like you said, everything that glitters isn't gold. I mean, there are some marriages that I have seen that look so good from the outside in. I mean, we even used to name them Claire Huxtable and Bill Cosby. And before you know it, I know she's awesome. But before you know it, those very couples will be getting a divorce. And you're like, what the heck happened?
What happened?
Personally, I grew up in a household with parents that what looked like a really good marriage, and then when they got divorced, everybody was like, what the heck just happened? I mean, they had get-togethers. They were, the neighborhood house to be at. I mean, we had parties and get-togethers for kids all the time, and and then my parents got divorced, and so there's also that piece of it that it may look good, but also those folks may be headed to a place of divorce. So.
Exactly. Well, CEOs, please stay tuned. We got some really cool